Welcome to this overview of Hegel's philosophy of right. Throughout this video, you're going to learn some of the basic philosophical principles of Hegel's philosophy of right, as well as be introduced to the logical structure of the book as a whole. The hope is that this video will be a fantastic primer to the next Philosophy Portal course, focused on teaching the same book, Hegel's philosophy of right. To learn more or to sign up, visit philosophyportal.online. Hegel's main aim with the philosophy of right is to help us make a transition, a historical transition, specifically between what he sees as an age of politics governed by authority to an age of politics governed by feeling. This move from an external objectivity, reified in a certain authoritarian political body, to an age governed by affect or feeling or subjective interiority, is a theme that runs not only throughout Hegel's philosophy of right, but also throughout Hegel's entire philosophical works. If we want to think about this transition in relationship to archetypal philosophical figures, we might think about the age of authority being one represented by the philosophy of someone like Plato. Here Hegel will give explicit reference throughout the philosophy of right to Plato's Republic. And if we want to think about the transition which Hegel is observing towards an age of feeling or subjective affect, we might think about a philosopher like Immanuel Kant, whose philosophical revolution, which we still feel the impacts of today, of the introduction of the subjective a priori transcendental frame, gives us reason to question any idea of an objective external outside, and rather shifts our attention and our focus to a subjective interiority, or subjective affects, and our own processes of conceptualization. Hegel wants to maintain this distinction. He wants to preserve this distinction between the world of authority and the world of feelings. But at the same time, he wants to raise it up. He wants to lift it higher. Using Hegelian terminology, we might say that Hegel wants to sublate the world of feeling. And we will find out throughout this video that Hegel wants to sublate this world of feeling towards a world of thinking and conceptualization, which is not given a priori in an external objectivity, but is also not, let's say, sunken or remaining in the immediacy of one's own subjective affects and feelings. The big challenge here for political science is that we are, as thinking subjects, struggling between learning the truth inclusive of the actual state, the political state, without either succumbing to external authority, being told what is right. Here in the context of philosophy of right, having an external authority or an external master figure tell us what is the truth or what is right. And at the same time, not to resort to our own immediate feeling or our own immediate subjective affects as what is right and what is true. The in-between space, or the process of thinking itself, where we may rely on external teachers, where we may rely necessarily on external guidance from others, older than us, more experienced than us, perhaps wiser than us, while at the same time being in touch with the immediacy of how we feel, the immediacy of the negativity of the moment, the feeling that things are not as they should be, that things could be a lot better. Both of these dimensions play a role in becoming, for Hegel, a modern political subject. But neither of these poles really get at what is true and what is right. And the book, The Philosophy of Right, is designed to help us. One of the first problems, or one of the first dangers that Hegel sees in this process is the emergence of what he will call evil consciousness. Evil consciousness represents a strange blend of authority and the immediacy of intuition. On the level of the evil consciousness representing an authority figure, someone who is telling us what is good and what is right for the collective, perhaps for the entire community, perhaps for the entire nation, perhaps even for the entire world. But that this entire effort of proclaiming to be an external authority figure that knows the good and knows the true, in short, that knows the way, is something that is merely coming from a self-serving vanity, a self-serving feeling. Here we should beware of figures who claim to represent authority figures that know the way, that know the true. Perhaps it's not too much of a stretch to suggest that such figures are often embodied in populist figures, or even charismatic religious figures. Whether secular or religious, the form is the same, and something that Hegel would see as the expression of evil consciousness, precisely on the level of the dialectics of good and evil, which Hegel will try to articulate throughout the philosophy of right, where one must be in touch with the immediacy of one's, let's say, desire to immediately know the true, the good, and the way for the entire species. One must be in touch with this desire, and at the same time, one must be incredibly skeptical and critical of this desire within oneself. I think reading Hegel's philosophy of right and having an extended long-term mediation with such a work can itself be perhaps a defense mechanism against this tendency within ourselves to embody the evil consciousness, to speak on behalf of the collective from a position of vanity, from a position of one's own selfishness, from a position of one's own obfuscation of lack. Ultimately, Hegel's work here does try to work with the dialectical distinction that is perhaps one of the most famous throughout all of philosophy, that of the distinction between sophism and truth, or the sophists and Platonic philosophy. And what's at stake in this distinction between sophism and truth, or sophism and Platonic philosophy, is the coincidence between the individual and the universal. What the evil consciousness does not reconcile with is the fact that the universal moves through every individual. Hegel suggests that this is the fundamental principle which Plato introduced in the Republic, and a truth which represents a worldwide revolution. A worldwide revolution which we are still feeling the effects of today, and which has been far from realized. When we think about utopian global political philosophies, when we think about our own intuition that the world could and should be a much better place, a much higher order place for the whole of humanity. For Hegel, what is being expressed in the immediacy of that desire is this coincidence between the individual and the universal. Again, the fact that the universal moves through every individual. Here we see a remarkable philosophical idea in the sense that how can we reconcile ourselves in this transition from the world of authority where the universal does not include the individual where the universal is an externality, something outside of us, something foreign to us, something not involving us, to the world of subjective affects, the subjective turn in general, where we have the principle of individuality, but we can quickly lose the principle of universality. In some sense, Hegel's entire philosophy, his entire philosophical effort, rests at this precise turning point. This turning point where we must think together, the individual and the universal, as Hegel maintains throughout the philosophy of right. One cannot just understand individuality independent of universality, and one cannot just understand universality independent of individuality. The two must be brought into a dialogue. And it is that worldwide revolution where Hegel, again, grounds his philosophy, but also invites us into philosophy. And this principle is where Hegel starts to articulate that philosophy itself is limited by what is. Here we could say that what is, most fundamentally, is this unity between the individual and the universal and the individual. And working from this standpoint, without trying to jump ahead of ourselves or project our own universal visions of what should be, what is right, is the ground upon which thinking, and specifically thinking the political, may start to unfold in a dialectic with what should be, which is necessarily beyond philosophy. To accept this limitation internal to philosophy, to stay with thinking what is, as well as engaged in the beyond of philosophy, of what should be, what might be, is what Hegel calls the rose and the cross of the present, which is a beautiful phrase which captures in one essence both the beauty of the rose, the beauty of our present moment, as well as the pain and the bleeding of the cross, the limitation of the individual. By definition, the fact that the individual and the universal coincide necessitates that the individual be limited, that the individual know and work with one's own limit, as will become so important throughout the rest of this video, in order to truly become universal. Perhaps this is the ultimate contradiction and the ultimate thinking tool that we can learn from Hegel's philosophy. Indeed, Hegel thinks that this contradiction is actual in a very specific historical moment in European civilization, but at the same time, something which is not reducible to European civilization. That of the principle introduced for Hegel in the break within Christianity of Protestantism, of the self-will. We might see the self-will as, again, something which is being introduced as a part of this larger subjective turn towards the world of affects and the world of interiority, on the level of feeling and in response to and in negation of the world of authority. However, Hegel is critical of this historical appearance, as suggested earlier, in the sense that it has not yet been raised to the conceptualization and thinking process as such. And that is what, in some sense, Hegel views his gesture in relationship to the historicity of Christianity and in relationship to the historicity of specifically Protestantism, to raise this principle of the self-will to raise this principle of the immediacy and the present moment of the self-will from feeling to concept. And he suggests that this is where we get the philosophical science of right, in the idea of right. And the idea of right, for the present moment of the self-will, being not only the spiritual gravity towards which our will tends, but also the condition of possibility to build a true spiritual kingdom here on earth. Of course, a spiritual kingdom here on earth does not yet exist. Yet it is what our will thinks should be. It is again the gravity towards which our will circulates. And for Hegel, this possibility, this condition of possibility for the spiritual kingdom cannot exist without the idea of right, and specifically the philosophical science of right. Here, Hegel moves into the way in which the individual, acting in relationship to the universal, and the universal accommodating the individual, must unify theory and practice in order to make a home within the spiritual kingdom. This unity of theory and practice is, for Hegel, a true philosophy. A true philosophy cannot disconnect theory from practice, as would be thinking without willing. And a true philosophy cannot disconnect practice from theory, which would be willing without thinking. This relationship between thinking without willing and willing without thinking is one which threatens our capacity to make a home in the spiritual kingdom and to act in accordance with the gravity of the will itself. He gives examples of thinking without willing as a type of fanatical contemplation and withdrawal from the world. He gives examples of willing without thinking as a type of destructive or will towards demolition, which ultimately does not stand the test of history. Hegel, I think, sees thinking without willing, that is, fanatical contemplation, as a temptation within certain religious traditions, which emphasize a spiritual withdrawal from the world. And he recognizes the temptation of a willing without thinking as expressed in many political activist orientations. What helps us to overcome both of these extremes for Hegel is to see the negative and the limitation of our individuality as itself a positive expression. To see the negative or the limit of one's individuality as itself a positive expression is, of course, a principle which challenges our own subjective affects, which challenges the aforementioned tendencies of the evil consciousness to pretend as if it's not limited, to pretend as if, again, it knows the way, it knows the truth, it knows the right, not only for itself, not only for all time, but for all subjectivity. So it's not random that Hegel is introducing this principle as fundamental and as the key upon which we may enact the worldwide revolution that is the coincidence or the unity between the individual and the universal. That the universal moves through the individual and becomes singular, and that singularity itself represents universality, is what Hegel calls the freedom of the will and the gravity of all wills, and the principle of self-limitation as the very key to this singular universality, which raises the immediacy of our subjective affects from a childlike impulse to the maturity of man. This is, of course, a developmental philosophy. It's a philosophy that sees the seed of our freedom in our childhood, but does not reduce our freedom to our childhood. Hegel does not see us as immediately free. Hegel sees our freedom as a possibility within the seed of our childhood, as mentioned, but as something that only becomes actual in the process of self-limitation, which is again the key through which the universal singularizes itself. And in that singularity represents true universality. Here, Hegel sees again an interesting link with the Christian doctrine, in the sense that the contradiction of man's will as containing the seed of freedom but not actual freedom, in the movement from the natural will, what Hegel will link to impulse and caprice, towards the emergence of the spiritual will, which is truly free in its singularity and at the same time its universality. Hegel will suggest that the impulse to duty, the movement from a childlike immediacy to a mature mediation in the emergence of an adult human being, is something that requires us to rise above all immediate particularity in a universality, but at the same time, in that very expression of our universality, we must situate it in, again, a particularity. And that specific contradiction of needing to rise above particularity while at the same time becoming ourselves quite particular is one that will become evident when we explore the overall book structure of the philosophy of right, and where that movement of rising above particularity and again becoming hyper-particularized gets expressed on the level of the ethical system when we encounter marriage, the family, and the necessity of educating the next generation, of educating children. Here, this relationship between children and becoming an adult capable of raising the next generation of children is where we can also situate Hegel's Metaphysics of Infinity. It is in Hegel's Metaphysics of Infinity where we see the proposition that the child's will, the natural will, is in fact a closed circle which is self-similar with slavery and servitude. This child's will opens up into a line, what Hegel calls a bad infinite, or a spurious infinity, a line pointing towards progress, a line pointing towards a higher future which is not actual, and which in fact can never be actualized. It is only when this line turns back on itself and becomes what Hegel will call the circle of circles, where we can understand true infinity and where all dependence on other things falls away. Here we can see that the child's circle, that of slavery, is an absolute dependence, something necessitated by our condition of birth, something necessitated by our self-appearance as the bodies that we do appear in, towards becoming a mature adult in which dependence on other things falls away, deeply desired, but at the same time so difficult, in the sense that we can only win our independence through, as mentioned, self-limitation. This process of moving from the child's circle to the spurious infinity of the line, towards the circle of circles, in which all dependence on other things falls away, is where Hegel differentiates his dialectic from that of Plato's. For Hegel, Plato's dialectic only comes to a negative result, where the opening of the circle to the line never reaches back into a self-relation. This higher dialectic that Hegel is proposing suggests that a positive result comes out of the negative, that a higher result does come out of self-limitation. And this is again the key to true infinity, as well as in Hegel's mind the modernization of Plato's worldwide revolution articulated in the Republic, that the universal and the individual move through each other and can only be understood in such terms. From there, let's quickly discuss the overall book structure. In the overall book structure, we see that Hegel is really using and working with his own science of logic, articulated in, of course, the science of logic, in the dialectical principle of the abstract, the negative, and the concrete. We see this in the book structure when we look at the three main sections of the book. The first section of the book is titled Abstract Right, which of course can be linked to the abstract dimension of the dialectic. The second section of the book is titled Morality, which we can link to the negative side of the dialectic. And finally, the ethical system, which is the third part of the book, can be linked to the concrete. And so we have abstract right as abstract, we have morality as negative, and we have the ethical system as concrete. I would like to make just a quick point that in analyzing this structure of the philosophy of right, which is clearly using and depending on Hegel's science of logic, we see the problem with thinking in terms of thesis, antithesis, synthesis. The ethical system is not so much a synthesis as it is the concrete realization of human life from the level of family to the level of world history, which does not close or resolve or reconcile everything in a type of naive positivity, but is rather the space of absolute freedom and an unending process that involves the totality of the human species. Let's start with abstract right. Abstract right involves three dimensions, as all three sections are divided up into three. Hegel does have a tendency and a desire to divide up his work in this way. The three sections of abstract right are titled property, contract, and wrong. What is most interesting in this division is that we see at the very ground of abstract right a dimension, namely property, which is so fundamental to get right as both situated within a dialectical process and is at the same time not reified as an absolute condition of political economy. Hegel suggests that property itself is necessary in terms of a mediating process from that childlike state towards building a home in the world and ultimately finding one's home in that true infinity, that infinite self-relation, which does not depend on anything and certainly does not depend on external property. And so hopefully in that articulation, what will be clear to you is that property is at once necessary and that property is at the same time destined to be relinquished, at least in terms of some sort of fundamental reification or some sort of fundamental attachment to the truth of the things in themselves or the truth of true infinity itself. how we mediate property must be done between wills. That is, must be done between different free wills, different human beings. And this is where we get the necessity of contract. Contract for Hegel is the mediation of different wills in their relationship to external property. These contracts are meant to establish certain relations that cannot just be evidently present within the property itself, but must be negotiated between, let's say, the realm of intersubjectivity. Something which Hegel says is impossible for the child mind, but which is necessary for the work of the individual that is limiting itself in relationship to other wills. And in this process, one can commit wrongs. And for Hegel, there are 3 types of wrongs. The first is an unpremeditated wrong. That is, a wrong which was unintended, but nevertheless actual. Fraud, where one is willfully deceived or willfully deceives the other, in the contract, for example. And then finally, the worst of them all, violence and crime, where one is literally trying to destroy the other, where one is not even pretending to deceive the other, one is wronging the other directly and immediately, and of course, totally foreclosing the dimension of law and acting in opposition to the dimension of law, or the dimension what Hegel says is the condition of possibility for a good society. From this section, we enter morality, which is again the dimension which we might call the negative dimension of the dialectic and the book structure as a whole. The 3 sections that we find in morality can be called purpose and responsibility, intention and well-being, and finally, the good and conscience. Of these 3 sections, the good and conscience is by far the longest, and the area where Hegel spends the majority of his time in the second part of the book. Purpose and responsibility are mostly to establish the relationship between one's free will and one's own capacity to take responsibility for one's own free will, to set one's own purpose, and that while one cannot know the future and one cannot know all of the results or all of the consequences of one's will, that one is acting in such a way as that one is capable of taking responsibility for one's will and the consequences of not being able to know or not being able to predict everything in advance of one's actions. This brings us to what is the most important for Hegel in terms of action, which is right intention. While one can easily commit wrongs, even though one is engaging in right intention, what's most important is that one is committed to engaging in right intention towards the well-being of oneself and the well-being of others. And this, for Hegel, is one's duty. One's duty is to engage in right intention towards oneself and towards others, even if the results of that activity may produce wrongs, may hurt others. This is perhaps again related to the fact that we must accept the rose in the cross of the present. Here, right intention would be the rose, whereas the cross could be the way in which our intentions do not unfold the way we anticipated or the way in which we thought. To do one's duty, then, simply becomes our commitment to staying with right intention and staying towards well-being towards self and others, even if things will inevitably not go as we planned. And this brings us to the largest section of morality, which for Hegel is the idea of the good, which is necessary for freedom, and the conscience, which Hegel has a long expanded dialectic on the conscience as the deepest inner solitude and the deepest inner withdrawal, and at the same time not yet actual as an ethical system. Throughout the section, he will be pointing towards conscience as, let's say, the possibility of a concrete ethical system. He makes some remarkable notes that there are periods in world history where withdrawal into a pure conscience, where withdrawal into a pure solitude, is necessary in order to actualize the good. But nevertheless, on the stage of world history itself, the good and conscience are not actual, are not concrete, until they come out of their withdrawal and start to act on the world stage, and specifically to enact the ethical system, which is a system unified and in accordance with freedom of the individual and freedom of the universal. And that brings us to the ethical system as the concrete layer of Hegel's dialectic and the concrete layer of the philosophy of right. What is most interesting in the ethical system is that it moves from the most intimate level, that of the family, towards the most general layer, that of the state. And here we should always remember that when Hegel is articulating his ethical system, he is articulating his ethical system in regards to what is in the 19th century. This does not mean that Hegel's system and the ethical system as such is to be reified as the only possible ethical system, or the ethical system which is actual for us in the 21st century. Specifically, when one is working through different dimensions of how Hegel is conceiving the family, or the civic community, or the state, it is obvious that what is in the 21st century is different from what is in the 19th century. Hegel's point in the ethical system is not to, again, reify the 19th century ethical system, but rather to articulate the ethical system as what was true in his time, and in studying the way Hegel is thinking, perhaps we can once again think the ethical system in the 21st century as, in Hegel's philosophy, eternity itself is subject to historicity. Eternity is itself subject to the historical process. However, the terms, that is, the terms of the ethical system as the expression of family, civic community, and the state, are perhaps dimensions of the ethical system which we would not want to discard or abolish, as is so tempting for certain progressive political philosophies. But at the same time, we do not want to reify in absolute transcendental terms as if the dimensions of family, civic community, and state exist as they have been in the past, as is so tempting for many conservative political philosophies, but rather to work through these dimensions dialectically as they appear and as they present themselves to us in the 21st century. Starting with the family, Hegel thinks through the family on the level of marriage, on the level of means, that of providing for the family, as well as the education of children. What's really important here is to recognize that Hegel sees marriage as the foundation of the ethical system, and the ground upon which the concrete unveils itself and realizes itself. Here, providing for the family then becomes the next step. So we move from marriage to provision to education of children. From there, we move into civic community, where necessarily the family cannot remain insular, where the family cannot remain contained into itself, but must break itself open and apart into community, where we find a system of wants, a negotiation of desires between different community actors. And in this negotiation of wants and desires between different community actors, we find the necessity of both administration of justice as well as police and authority. Laws that must be in tune with and alive to the immediacy of the moment, and not, as it were, falling into any external objectivity or transcendental reification, which is ignorant of history and ignorant of subjectivity. And finally, the state, which is, of course, composed of a nested level of families and communities. The state is an internal polity, which is related to international law and ultimately world history. And of course, in the 2 centuries that have unfolded since Hegel's writing of this text, we have seen a number of different international organizations and international laws emerge on the stage of world history and of the freedom of the human species, which did not exist at Hegel's time, and a number of different global dimensions which the state now wrestles with on the level of global capital, on the level of global diversity and multiplicity, which Hegel could have only dreamed about, because simply they were not actual during Hegel's time. And so, studying the ethical system represents for us a great challenge. That is, the challenge of being able to think the 21st century, to be able to think of global politics today. Not in a way that obfuscates or ignores or deconstructs or negates the whole of world history, but rather a way of thinking that includes within itself the dimensions of abstract right, that is, property, contract, and wrong, in a way that includes morality, that is, purpose and responsibility, intention and well-being, the good and conscience, as well as that tries to enact from the most intimate grounds, the family, civic community, as well as the state itself, and ultimately the interrelations between states, which represents international law and the freedom of world history. That has been my offering and my overview of Hegel's philosophy of right. This overview is hopefully a fantastic introduction and justification for why studying Hegel's philosophy of right in great detail is worth the effort and worth the struggle. And if you're interested in joining me, Philosophy Portal will be teaching Hegel's philosophy of right starting May 18th. If you're watching this or listening to this after May 18th, it will also be available as a recording indefinitely. To learn more or to sign up, visit philosophyportal.online, and I hope to see you in class.